To talk about himself. His focus was on the families and children, and after he said that, he sort of bit his lip and clearly was starting to tear up. At the same time, during that Oval Office appearance with reporters, he also was very determined and showing his resolve, saying that this is sort of an act of war on the U.S., the first war of the 21st century, and that he was committed to doing everything possible to find those responsible for those attacks, those organizations or countries which support or harbor terrorism, and to work with the international community to wipe out terrorism. Aaron, the president saying it's a time of great tragedy, but that he was going to try to use this as an opportunity while he is in the White House to do everything possible to try to reduce the terrorism threat around the world. Aaron?
Before the president made his way to New York, he signed the formal declaration of a national emergency. That is a legal requirement that allows now the Pentagon to call up as many as 50,000 reservists, though the Pentagon briefing earlier today suggested the number will probably be somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000. Many of them in the Air Force, others in the Army, the Air Force flyers and support domestic patrols. As we understand it, many of the soldiers and their support, the Army, will be in support of people on the ground here. We see the White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer coming off and wait for the president to come off. As those of you who just may be getting home from work today, it has been a miserable day by and large in New York City. Cold, wet, rainy. That's what the president's walking into. Martin Savage.
Well, Aaron, one of the things that I wanted to bring out to you is the fact that a comment that has been made by so many of the workers that have been here, that have traveled from so far. Seeing it on television is one thing. Seeing it in person is vastly, vastly different. They remark that television, even with the many different angles, with the many different cameras that peer down consistently, just do not do justice to the amount of damage that has been done and to the extent of the tragedy that can be seen spreading out around the World Trade Center. So one of the clear things, obviously, as President of the United States, but also as an American, is the impression he is going to get from being here on the ground, from seeing it firsthand. Aaron?
Marty, we remember being with President Carter 20 years ago after the eruption of Mount St. Helens, when he flew over the site. Judy Woodruff, in fact, was on that helicopter with us back then, and that's exactly what he said, that television doesn't begin to do justice to the magnitude of something as big as the event is. The screen remains the size it is, and it all has to fit in the screen, and when you see it in person, you do get this extraordinary sense of how large the area is. The other day, Gary Tuchman, who got quite close to Ground Zero, correspondent Gary Tuchman, talked about blocks and blocks, 10 blocks, I think, around the Trade Center that showed dramatic signs of destruction. Buildings collapsed, heavily damaged, and so the president flying overhead in the last few minutes, no doubt got an impressive and we suspect somewhat depressing look at the magnitude of what those two planes did when they came crashing into the towers of the World Trade Center at 8:48 in the morning on September 11th, and then again at 9:08 in the morning. How long ago that seems.
Yes, it does.
Marty?
Yes, Aaron.
Are you seeing any sense of busyness? We just, there's the president dressed in looks like a khaki jacket, just behind the fellow in the red Coast Guard uniform. Governor Pataki with him. They're moving behind that, looks like a fire truck to me, Newark Airport fire truck. The heliport, it would be a relatively easy location to secure, relatively easy, because on one side is the river. If that's in fact where they are, I believe it is. Yeah, I believe it is. They're clearly along the water, and it gives you one less area that is difficult to control. Obviously, it's not a perfect area, nothing is, but that would be a little bit easier. We saw a number of congressmen from the New York area who were part of whatever delegation, formal or otherwise, is there to meet the president. The New York governor, George Pataki, who has been in the city rather than the state capitol since this all began. And we certainly expect we'll see New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani as well making the walk. The FEMA director has been in town, a longtime friend of the president's, Joe Alba, and I believe in the Poole report, David Gregory said that a number of the people on the president's plane were wearing FEMA jackets. Judy can join us now. Judy?
Aaron, as we're watching these pictures of the president in New York, we can tell our viewers that our White House correspondent John King has learned that the president has declared a state of national emergency today, a legal requirement, we are told, tied to the decision to authorize the Pentagon to call up National Guard and military reservists in the wake of what happened on Tuesday. John King reporting the declaration cites the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and notes, quote, the continuing and immediate threat of further attacks on the United States, end quote. Now, of course, that's a reference to what investigative authorities are telling our reporters, that that it is not wrong to assume that there still are people in the United States with plans to do further great harm to this country. The president also issued an executive order, we're told, John King learning, authorizing the Pentagon to issue that call up to guard, and he has sent a letter to Congress notifying them of all of these decisions. Again, this reporting coming from our White House correspondent John King. Aaron?
I believe I saw this correctly. The president did not get into the usual limousine. He got in to one of those large SUVs that generally hold the Secret Service agents in the motorcade. I'm almost certain that's what I saw. It would one more small sign, but a sign nevertheless, that the security is quite tight. It looked also to us that a number of agents were in that SUV. President making his way from the west side, from the Hudson River across now, and it's not very far, to the site, and there's a look at the site. It is still smoldering all these many hours later. And even despite the rain that has created a somewhat dangerous situation, slippery, muddy, it has certainly been a dreadfully uncomfortable day to do this awful and uncomfortable work. Martin Savage has been down there all day, and he knows better than any of us here, certainly, how uncomfortable it has been for the recovery teams.
Well, that's right, Aaron. It has been very difficult for the recovery teams. It's been difficult for the people who've been doing the digging. A lot of the digging work had been done almost by hand, literally bucket load by bucket load that is passed in a human chain. That is done because they say that there is so much smaller pieces of debris, dirt and papers and pieces of the building that are really too small to be handled, because what has happened is that they are trapped inside of steel girders, they're trapped inside of large chunks of concrete. So they cannot approach with the heavy equipment until this debris is pulled out of the way. The fact that it was raining so heavily made that work very difficult. At times it had to stop. The fact that it's dried out now means that the work can begin again. And we have been told that all of that material is sifted through, that the buckets are actually turned upside down and carefully gone through, looking for evidence, looking for remains. And then, of course, there was the threat of the wind. It has subsided somewhat, but still, those buildings that are still standing but damaged are very much a threat to the rescue crews. I was standing out here this morning, Aaron, staring. I find myself looking at it. You are fixated on that spot when you are here, even though the towers are gone. And a police officer sort of caught me deep in thought and said, it isn't going to change. It looks the same. And he's right, it is going to change. And I found that it was something inside of me, and maybe in a lot of people. That's what's changed.
Well, it may not change, but our impressions, how we feel about it, tends to change as we stare at these things. There was, we saw a painful, I think maybe is the right word, account of the other day that the search teams, as they go in, are carrying essentially small dishes or plates so that as they find remains, they can be taken to morgues and held, and ultimately DNA tests can be done. This is how, in many cases, people are going to be identified, so families can, when that becomes necessary, have funerals for their loved ones, say goodbye in ways more appropriate than this. Thousands of DNA tests are going to be done. There's still almost 5,000, 4,700 people that we know of who are reported missing. And it is, we also, there have been a number of accounts of people who have made cell phone calls out and helping rescue workers to locate them and get them out in the first hours. There hasn't been much of that, and no survivors have been found today. There's also an effort made to get cell phone calls in, that is to say, to call the cell phone numbers of people who were working in the building. The cell phone technology essentially would allow then the phone company to track where that cell phone is. It also, if the phone is still working, the ringing sound itself might help rescue workers identify where someone is buried, possibly still alive, possibly not, but would help them locate someone. There was a report I heard earlier today that rescue workers, some of the firemen thought they heard some pinging sound, someone maybe banging against something, and I haven't heard anything on that since. So what we know for certain is that so far today, no more survivors have come from the site at all. Marty?
You're right. When we talked to the rescuers that were coming out this morning, those that had worked the night shift, they said that they had not heard the typical sounds that had been heard days before. Yesterday, they were telling us of the cellular telephone calls that you were talking about. And they told us specifically what they knew about the individual. I'm not going to pass that along because it would only serve to give hope that may not really exist at this point to a family that waits. And then there were the tapping sounds, the knocking sounds that have been reported. And you know, it's a remarkable scene when you're down there at this search site, and there's literally hundreds, sometimes thousands of people at work at the same time. And there is a shout that goes out, quiet. And it's passed throughout the throng of the rescuers. And very quickly, that whole site becomes so silent, you can hear a pin drop, quite literally. The engines are shut down. Everyone stands in place, almost holding their breath and listening, along with that person who thought they heard something, and above all, hoping. Time goes by, and then it all begins again. Aaron?
Richard Roth is down on the streets as well, as Richard has been, as Martin Savage has been down there for the last several days. Richard?
Yes, Aaron, I kind of struck by something maybe with a political touch that doesn't really seem that pertinent now, but and it seems almost meaningless, but for months there was so much talk in New York City. When would the new President Bush visit this city? There had been more of a Democratic turnout here. It was now Senator Hillary Clinton. It all seems so ridiculous now. Who would have thought months back ago that this is how the President Bush would return to the city? He'd already been here once before, maybe a second time, but brief visits. But it's incomprehensible that anyone could think about that's how George Bush would come to a city which is needed of a morale boost. And they're going to get one today by the visit by the President.
Judy?
Aaron, again, as we keep an eye on the President, what the President is seeing there in New York City, we are constantly watching the developments in the investigative front, and I can tell you that our national security producer, Chris Plant, is reporting that the Defense Department's investigating the possibility, as hard as this is to believe, that 2 of the alleged terrorists involved in what happened on Tuesday may have attended schools run by the U.S. military. Now, this is according to a senior defense official. This official didn't reveal the names in question, so we don't know whom he's talking about or other specifics, such as what kinds of schools they may have attended, but the official said 2 of the names released on Friday by the Justice Department, matching the names of people who had attended schools or courses sponsored by the U.S. military under a foreign military exchange program. Now, I should say that officials at the Pentagon are cautioning it's possible that these matching names are merely a coincidence, or that the terrorists were using false identities. And of course, we've been pointing that out on CNN all day long, that they may have taken on the identities of other people. Pentagon officials also wanting us to know that military officers from many countries around the world attend these U.S. military academies or courses every year. So this is done all the time, but what irony it would be if it turned out that one of these terrorists had been to school at a U.S. military-sponsored course. You're watching now in New York, streets of Lower Manhattan, a motorcade with the President of the United States.
See some people on the sidewalks there. Don't know if those are civilians or firefighters, rescue workers, as the motorcade makes its way through the city.
Aaron, can you tell us, do we assume traffic has been completely, maybe,
well,
maybe you've already answered this question.
Yeah, as you know, because of your years at the White House, whenever the president moves, essentially traffic around the president shuts down. If you're on a freeway, they shut down all the exits along the way. And in fact, the other day I heard former Vice President Gore make a remark about that as he talked about his new civilian life. There isn't much traffic down on Lower Manhattan. These days it's all pretty much cordoned off anyway. And clearly nothing is moving very nearly around the president at all. The president is, we believe, in one of the Suburbans, large SUVs that always accompany these motorcades, usually filled with Secret Service agents, sometimes medical personnel, all part of the formal movement process of a president of the United States. And these things are kind of large and unwieldy, as you can imagine, and particularly down in that part of Manhattan where the streets get a bit narrow and tight, as they'll move through here. And it has stopped, and we can't tell you why it has stopped. We just don't know.
Much longer motorcade than the typical one the president would be traveling in.
It seemed that way to me. That there were considerably more cars in the motorcade than you would normally see. And we assume that there are a fair number of New York City, New York State officials, FEMA officials, and the like. But as you can see, that's the back end of it, and it's still going. The white cars would be almost certain would be New York City police cars, would be part of the motorcade. We see a number of ambulances as well. So you would have New York City police, you would have Secret Service. Kelly, you most recently, I guess, of us been in these motorcades. Who else is in that long line, would you suspect?
Well, it's hard for me to see from the vantage point looking at the monitor here, but as you and Judy both noting, obviously a tremendously long motorcade. You have senior staffers and those traveling with the president. You have a whole slew of Secret Service officers there. You have, New York City Police Department and ambulances on hand, and more security measures than any of us really know. And as you know, Aaron, the U.S. Secret Service not talking about, and we certainly understand they never do, talking about the security measures that the Secret Service takes to make sure that the president is safe and sound. All we know is that the U.S. is really operating on a heightened state of alert, and that is expected to continue for an indefinite amount of time while there is still a concern about threats out there. So we just can't underscore the security situation. As we also noted yesterday, we saw it firsthand around the White House. We saw that the Secret Service decided to expand the security perimeter around the White House, basically closing off to pedestrian traffic several blocks around the White House, and also to any vehicular traffic as well. So they are taking every step they can take to make sure that the president and his top aides are safe and sound.
Part of what's so difficult right now for the administration, for the country in many ways, is that while the president wants to project a sense that things are okay, in fact things are something less than okay. This gathering at the National Cathedral today that Judy was at Most notably absent from that was the vice president, who we gather was kept away for security reasons. They didn't want the president and the vice president in the same location.
Absolutely, Aaron. The vice president remaining, we understand, at the presidential retreat at Camp David, as you noted, for security reasons. You touched on a very important point, the delicate balancing act, because certainly the administration saying it is not business as usual. It certainly is not and cannot be after what this nation witnessed on Tuesday. But at the same time, as you noted, the White House wanting to show that government is up and running, that things are being taken care of, that federal workers are returning to their jobs, that the U.S. government is doing everything and throwing all resources possible into search and recovery efforts. So there is that balancing act, trying to get the American people to somehow move forward and get back to business and get on with their lives. But, you know, certainly no one's saying it's business as usual. And that was an important part of today, the president declaring this the National Day of Prayer and Remembrance, the president calling on all Americans during their lunch hour to go to a church, a synagogue, a mosque, to take some time and pray for the victims, for the families, for the thousands and thousands of people, really everyone, Aaron, as we've noted, affected by this, because as you know, Aaron, you really run into almost everybody that has been touched on based on this tragedy, either directly or indirectly. Almost everyone knows someone or a friend of a friend who was either in these trade centers or on a plane or in some way has a family friend affected. So that is part of what the president hoped to do today. Aaron?
Well, you're being pretty much drawn out by a plane going overhead. It can hardly be business as usual in the country when in the president's declaration of national emergency today it cites, quote, the continuing and immediate threat of further attacks on the United States. We have another pool report. David Gregory is the pool reporter traveling with the president, and he is filing for all of us to hear, and so we'll listen in to what he has to say with the president.
This is David Gregory traveling with President Bush now in Lower Manhattan, where the president is now meeting with local search and rescue teams. He's alongside Governor Pataki and Mayor Giuliani as they shake some hands, meet fire commissioners and rescue crews. We are standing about 100 yards to the north of what used to be the North Tower of the World Trade Center, and I am literally footsteps away from a huge pile of rubble that was Building 7, which is now smoking and completely destroyed. This housed the Secret Service, and the president is just now getting his first look at what remains of the North and South Tower. The poignant moments are all around the president, raising his thumb to a group of firefighters in the distance who are still working to clear the debris from the North Tower. The president going along and shaking hands. I can see him mouth the words, "I appreciate you," as he goes down the line. Those men he's waving to, again, as I say, about 100 yards away. The smoke is very thick here, though the skies have cleared, and there is still the rumble of fighter jets overhead that also accompany the president, some 3 of them, as he was touring the damage from the air. The president, Governor Pataki, and Mayor Giuliani, as well as a 37-member congressional delegation touring the damage from the air for about 10 minutes. The president will remain here as he listens to members of the New York Fire Department describe to him Building 7, where, again, the Secret Service office was housed. Mayor Giuliani pointing to some of the other damaged buildings in the area where windows are missing and are clearly structurally unsound. As the motorcade was moving through each of the cars with American flags on top, there were people lining the sidewalks, waving at the president, faces completely still and what is obvious, so completely sad and silent as the president's motorcade moved by. The president will stay at this location, get an assessment, we're told, of all the efforts underway right now. He will then move on to another location to assess the damage, and then we'll move on to meet some families and other rescue personnel one by one as he continues to take in the site, which is To those who have said that it is impossible to capture on television, it's certainly true, as the smoke is so thick down here. To see what are essentially phantoms, what used to be the World Trade Center. This is where the president is standing and looking up now and trying to take it all in. More as we continue. This is David Gregory reporting with the president.
David Gregory is the pool reporter today. The pool rotates day to day, David, down there. And I gather, Kelly, you may be able to help me on this, but my guess is it's a very small, there are several different sized pools, I think, aren't there? That's a very small one today.
Very small one. Standard practice, though, is always to have one television correspondent and television crew with the president at all times, and that, of course, today it is David Gregory of NBC. I believe there will be certainly someone representing newspapers, the wire services, magazines, and radio. They're keeping it very, very tight, of course, for security reasons. You heard David Aaron mention the president sort of giving a thumbs up to firefighters, saying, appreciate you. Clearly an opportunity for the president to really try to boost the spirits of these firefighters, these search and rescue teams who have been working around the clock and trying to go through that rubble. And as we've heard, family member after family member hoping and hoping that they will find some more survivors in that debris. The president, I think David said, got an aerial tour of the damage for about 10 minutes and then is on the ground and will get an assessment of all the search and rescue efforts and then meet with some families and rescue personnel. Aaron, you're really seeing the president try to do two things, as we've noted. We saw him go to the Pentagon to see some damage and meet with rescue workers. We definitely saw him do the prayer service today. He went to a hospital in the Washington, D.C. area yesterday to meet with victims. This is the part of the side of the president, his role here to try to comfort a grieving nation. At the same time, as you noted, putting forward orders to call up to 50,000 reservists to help with security and recovery efforts. Also, the administration preparing the nation for what it calls a long struggle, saying there would not be just potentially one military response, basically saying that this will be a long, possibly multi-year campaign to find those responsible and to stamp out terrorism around the world. So the administration definitely also trying to prepare the nation for what will be a very long battle against terrorism. Aaron?
Somewhere in that mass of people ahead of that girder, we suspect the president is, and we also suspect as time passes, we'll get some better pictures of the president down there, but we're probably not going to get him for a bit. The president was reluctant to go to the site until he was assured that it would not be too disruptive to the relief efforts and the rescue efforts, and we note it clearly has not disrupted the effort to cut that beam down, because you can see the torch, they continue to work and clear that area, that piece away, even as the president makes his way around the site. David Gregory in his pool report noted something that we had mentioned earlier, and that it is until you see it on the ground, in the air, in person, I guess, that you get a sense of the real magnitude of this. Martin Savage has seen much of it over the last couple days. Marty?
Well, I can empathize very well with the reporter that was giving us that pool report, and even the President of the United States. I've spent a lot of time around ground zero. Your first impressions, where every sense in your body feels, sees, smells, even tastes the disaster that took place there, is something that the television will never give to you. And it has an impact on you. It changes you, and it would be very interesting to hear the president's comments, having been there. There's so many times we have struggled, even as reporters, to try to give you words, to try to give you some verbal depiction to go along with the pictures, and you can't. And I think when the president's there, he sees that as well. And meantime, we watch these fighter jets continue to provide cover overhead as the president walks below.
One of the things about this, Marty, it seems to us, is that in terms of describing what is left down there, the awful mess down there, the pictures, whatever the limitations of television, and certainly there are some, but whatever those limitations, the pictures themselves still speak volumes. The smoke still rising. Now on Friday, late Friday afternoon speaks volumes. Judy?
Yeah, Aaron, I'm watching the same pictures you are and wondering maybe you or Marty can help me understand where the people are walking to tour. What is the relationship between that and where the rubble is and where the human remains are? I'm trying to understand how is it possible to get close enough to look at it without being physically on top of it?
Well, Marty, weigh in
Marty?
here too.
Well, first of all, let me tell you that I'm at a disadvantage that I cannot see on a television monitor exactly what you are seeing. But one of the things to point out, the areas where they have always felt that the greatest chance for survival would be people that are now underground. No matter how they got there, whether it was in the form of the collapse or whether they had been underground at the time or near ground level and then collapsed into the ground. That's where they believe the chance of survivors are. The sub-basements of the World Trade Center are said to go down at least 6 levels, not 6 stories, deeper than that, 6 levels. Some of these ceilings are 20 feet high. So it is quite possible that there is an area that is being cleared out and prepared because that's where they feel most likely the chances are of finding. But I can't tell you specifically where the president is walking. He would not be walking in an area, though, where they have an active search for a survivor going on.
But Judy, as a practical matter, the damage is so broad and so widespread that wherever, assuming the president is within even a couple of blocks, and surely he is, it's a terrible scene down there, and it is not unlikely there are victims of the collapse still there. Just picking up on something that Marty just said, there's a tunnel that the PATH trains are the commuter trains that run between New Jersey and what was the trade center. That was the end point, or the beginning point, I guess, depending which way you're going. And crews from the other side, from the New Jersey side, with the Jersey City Fire Department, continue to work through the tunnel. They are hopeful, as Marty indicated, that's a natural air pocket, and that perhaps if they work quickly enough, and it's flooded now, but if they can work quickly enough, pumping out, clearing away, working their way through it, there is a possibility, just a possibility, but a possibility they may find someone alive, Judy.
Aaron, we've also learned, we've been talking about the many roles that a president fills at a time like this. He's keeping an eye, of course, on the investigation. He's looking to the military front, to what our options are as a nation. He's touring, he's been comforting families of those who are missing and presumed dead. We also have been told today that he has proclaimed that flags throughout the country will remain at half-staff through not just tomorrow, which I think had been the original plan, but through Saturday, September the 22nd, which extends this period of national observance, if not mourning, at least for one more week. And I will also tell you, I see that CNN correspondent Jean Meserve has reported in talking to Walmart and other stores that sell flags, that the sales of American flags have shot way up. Walmart reporting it sold 314,000 American flags just on Tuesday and Wednesday this week. In the previous 2 days, it had only sold 15,000. Kmart sold 200,000 flags. So the point we're making is that there is a burst of patriotism in this country.
Yeah, it's pretty clear when we've been, and we haven't had obviously much time to be out and about, but when we've been out, we have certainly seen in New York signs of that. We saw an American flag in a restaurant the other night. Some firefighters came in and they were applauded and serenaded with the national anthem or God Bless America. It is one of those moments too. The president is down touring in the area. This is tape of the president as he circled the area around the Trade Center. He's approaching the area of the Trade Center. This would be the pool footage that we're just now getting in, and this took place not all that long ago, like perhaps a half hour ago. We lose track of time a little bit these days. coming into Manhattan. Well, that looks to me like the southern tip of the island. So we're just kind of wheeling around, and I would guess there we go. As we zoom in, you see where it all once was. It's really, to my memory at least, the first time that I have seen the south tip of the island, of Manhattan Island, looking back at where the Trade Center was. All our focus has been from the other side, from the north looking down. Shot of the president's helicopter landing at a heliport along the Hudson. And that's a scene live that we have all become too familiar with over the last few days, Judy.
Well, Aaron, we're going to, of course, keep our cameras trained on that area of South Manhattan where President Bush and other dignitaries are getting their first look at the rescue recovery efforts there. But today in Washington at the Justice Department, they were giving out more information on the suspected hijackers. Attorney General John Ashcroft released the names of 19 men suspected of hijacking the 4 airliners that went down on Tuesday. Now, all 19 of those are presumed dead, of course. Law enforcement officials tell CNN all of the men can be linked to suspected terrorist leader Osama bin Laden. FBI Director Robert Mueller described the efforts his bureau has taken to investigate the attacks on Tuesday.
As of today, we have 4,000 FBI special agents who are working on the case in various offices around the country and on various aspects of the investigation, and we have 3,000 support employees also on the investigation. 20 FBI legal offices are running down leads overseas, and all 56 FBI offices around the country are engaged in the investigation.
It's FBI Director Robert Mueller. And now for the latest developments in the investigations underway, let's go to Mike Betcher at CNN Center in Atlanta. Mike.
Well, Judy, they're looking at those 19 names. As you said, they believe that they do have contact somehow with Osama bin Laden. What they're trying to find out is what groups did these people actually belong to? And I have information gleaned from intelligence sources about some of the groups they're looking at and some of the individuals. Let's begin with Islamic Jihad of Egypt, sometimes called Al-Jihad. It is led by a man named Ayman Zawahiri, and this is a picture of Zawahiri on the left with bin Laden. That was taken about a year ago. He is a top lieutenant of bin Laden. We have a fact sheet on this man. He goes either by Abu Fatma or Dr. Abdel Muiz. He's Egypt's most wanted man, widely regarded as military commander and chief strategist of the militant Islamic Jihad, or Al-Jihad. And he is the personal physician and close associate to Osama bin Laden. Now, we also have a second group and person that's being looked at by U.S. intelligence agencies, and frankly, this name puts chills down the spines of counter-terrorists who work in this country. He is being looked at but has not been connected that I know of or have been told, but I am told that he's looked at as one of the people that could have a connection. His name is Imad Mughniyeh. Imad Mughniyeh is well known in terrorism circles. This is not Imad Mughniyeh, actually. This is, we'll take that off. In fact, only one picture in the last 21 years exists of Imad Mughniyeh. He was one of the original founding members of Lebanese Hezbollah, and up until this event that happened in New York and Washington, terrorism experts say he killed more Americans and prosecutors in this country than any other terrorist in the world. He is responsible, they say, for the U.S. embassy bombing in Beirut, the Marine barracks bombing, hostage-taking, bombings in Argentina, bombings in Saudi Arabia, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, a link between bin Laden and Imad Mughniyeh came to light back in 1994 when intelligence sources were able to discovered that at an Islamic conference in the Sudan, bin Laden and Mukniya came together to talk at this conference in the night, and that they believe some of the seeds could have been planted back then in 1994 for what is happening now. Not the specific plan, but a general strategy. That's at least a theory they're working on or looking at right now. Now, more evidence of the bin Laden-Mukniya connection came from this man you saw earlier, Ali Muhammad, who was a U.S. Special Forces sergeant. Ali Muhammad was recruited by the Al-Qaeda organization, and he testified at the trial of terrorists who were convicted of conducting the Africa embassy bombings. Let's look at that testimony. I'll read it to you. He says, "I was aware of certain contacts between Al-Qaeda and Al-Jihad organization on one side and Iran and Hezbollah on the other side. I arranged security for a meeting in the Sudan between Mukniya, Hezbollah's chief, and bin Laden. Hezbollah provided explosives training for Al-Qaeda and Al-Jihad. Iran supplied Egyptian Jihad with weapons. Iran also used Hezbollah to supply explosives that were disguised to look like rocks." Now, this came in public testimony, and it relates to terrorist activities up to the African embassy bombings, but that is a public link by a former member of Al-Qaeda between Mukniya and Osama bin Laden. So that's something very important to keep an eye on if that pans out as a lead. I will tell you that I spent some time in Beirut this summer, talked to leaders of Hezbollah, because Hezbollah's name was brought up in that testimony. Hezbollah denies they have any intentions ever to attack the United States with any terrorism. They're very emphatic about that, and I want to make that point clear. That's what they say. But these various links are being looked at in the intelligence community, and there are a lot of links to look at, Judy.
All right, Mike Betcher in Atlanta watching all these investigative threads, and I would just, one question that immediately comes to my mind, but I'm not going to ask you this now, Mike, is how, if they're coming up with all this information now, after the fact, why weren't we knowing about it earlier? But we're going to be talking to someone in a moment who can perhaps help us answer that question. At the Pentagon, they're not only keeping an eye on the investigative aspects of this, they're of course also looking at what are the next steps militarily. And for both of those angles, let's turn to CNN's military affairs correspondent, Jamie McIntyre. Jamie?
Well, Judy, the Pentagon announced today, as we reported last night, that the Pentagon has requested and President Bush has authorized a call-up of thousands of reservists to back up some of the people who are flying combat air patrols over the United States and also providing disaster relief. Each service, the order is approved for 50,000 reservists to be called to active duty. Each of the services have reviewed what it is that they've been asked to do and identified requirements so far for about 35,000 reservists. The breakdown is about as follows. The Army is planning to call up about 10,000 people. The Air Force, 13,000. Many of those will be air crews and pilots for these planes that are flying, either flying over the United States, providing homeland defense, or on strip alert, waiting to be sent on a moment's notice to take to the air. The Marines will be calling up 75,000 people, the Navy 3,000, the Coast Guard 2,000. They're going to be providing everything from port operations to medical support to engineering support, support of civil authorities, even things like chaplains and military police will be called up. And initially what they're doing is they're asking asking for volunteers. You might ask, well, who are these reservists? And basically they're your co-workers, they're your neighbors. They're my cameraman today, is in the military reserve. And the head of reserve affairs for the Pentagon said today that they're getting an enormous response from reservists who say they are volunteering for duty.
We've had people who are knocking on the doors seeking to help. They want to serve. They want to be a part of this. They're very emotional. We've had to say, wait a little bit. You know, we've only had a matter of hours since this all began. We're proceeding along our way, and now we have the authorization to bring those people on board.
Now, the way the U.S. military is structured today, it can't launch any major military operation without the help of reservists. That's part of the plan. But this mobilization is really geared more toward, as I said, homeland defense, making sure the United States is protected from any future threats, and support of civil authorities who are engaged in disaster relief. If the United States moves ahead with military action against suspected terrorists, that will probably necessitate another call-up of reserves. Judy?
All right, Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon. And Jamie, as you've been talking, we've been looking on the right side of our screen at the president's motorcade in Lower Manhattan. These are live pictures of President Bush. We've been reporting to you about his activities there as his helicopter landed at the southern tip of Manhattan, and he has been taking a close look at the recovery and rescue efforts underway there in the vicinity of the World Trade Center. But we're just beginning to get a sense of, the enormity. In fact, none of us, you've been talking about this all day long, Aaron in New York and my colleagues, just beginning to get a sense of the enormity of the devastation there in New York City. While we're looking at this, we want to have joining us someone who has been very involved at the Pentagon. Formerly, she was the Deputy Chief of Army Intelligence. She is retired Army General Claudia Kennedy. And General Kennedy, I'm going to pose to you the question that I halfway posed to our correspondent Mike Betcher a minute ago. If we're getting so much information so quickly now about these suspected terrorists, why didn't we have it before?
Judy, I think that part of the answer lies in the way we've been looking at the terrorist problem. Is it a criminal issue or is it a military threat? And when you handle it as a criminal issue, then what we do is we take a look at it through the FBI, we gather evidence, we try to build an airtight case for court. But when you look at it as a military threat, you look at it for early warning of impending attack, and you try to destroy it before it comes at you.
You're saying the threshold is lower. Is that it?
The threshold is lower for action if you handle it as a military threat. But what I'm saying here is that some time ago, I think we went in one direction, and that is to look at it as a criminal issue, and we wanted to make sure we could bring these people to justice through the court system. And I think what's happened is the world has changed, and our approach probably at this point needs to be reviewed and say, do we still want to try to handle this primarily as a matter of law enforcement, or is it now really a military threat that the military needs to deal with?
Well, just as an example, in the last few days we've learned that that the whereabouts of Osama bin Laden, the United States has been looking at that for a number of years. There have been several instances in recent years where people had authorities had identified his whereabouts, but nothing was done. There was a report yesterday in the Associated Press at the end of the Clinton administration. They had a lot of information, but they chose not to take military action. What would it take to change that approach, I guess is my question.
Well, my thought is, like a lot of Americans today, that what happened on the 11th of September has altered our viewpoint about what terrorism is, how devastating it can be, and it is probably the beginning of some thoughtful discussion about what it is we need to do in response to terrorism. I would say that we have got some superb people in the national security policy area and in operations, and we need to go ahead and take a hard look at this. And I am sure that the President and his team of advisors is taking a very hard look at this even now.
And you believe we're up to the job?
I absolutely know we are.
All right, retired Army General Claudia Kennedy, formerly Deputy Chief of Army Intelligence. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Judy.
I appreciate it. And now back to Aaron in New York as we see these pictures of the recovery effort.
It's a New York Fire Department tent in the foreground there, and somewhere in the background we suspect the president is, and we're certain we'll get better pictures of this when the pool is allowed to get its pictures out. It's a very small pool with the president. Quickly, we mentioned a minute ago that there was some effort to work through the PATH tunnel, the commuter train tunnel from New Jersey to the World Trade Center, in hopes that there were people still alive in the tunnel. Officials now say that is off. There is nothing to salvage. Correspondent Jeff Flock has been working the Midwest the last couple of days. He was in Wisconsin yesterday. He's in Dubuque, Iowa today, taking the pulse of the country from that vantage point, and he joins us now. Jeff.
Indeed, Aaron, our cross-country tour continues. This is it's a window and door factory, Eagle Windows and Doors. Perhaps you've heard of them. This is one of the places, one of the countless places around the U.S. today that have been marking this day with moments of silence and other observances. And Darren, you were saying you don't want the president's job right now as we were watching him tour.
I couldn't imagine the feelings and emotions that the president has right now. I am so much with him in spirit and in faith. I really hope the best for him.
You folks are a long way away here in Iowa, but you feel very much attached and connected to what's been going on. How is that?
I don't think there's anybody around the country that doesn't somehow know somebody who knows somebody or have a direct relative who was in the area at the time to be affected by it.
We're talking about the reserve call-up. I know you have reservists that work here with you. That's coming. Do you have fear about what's coming down the road now, the next step that this nation takes?
I think there's fear, but there's also just a sense of something's going to be done this time. You know, it's not going to just be washed away. We're going to have to take care of it this time.
This is tape of the president meeting some New York firefighters, New York police officers, some of the workers. This is tape we got back just a minute ago. Jeff will allow your conversations to go on while our viewers also watch the president as he works his way through this group of rescue workers. Look at that face, how tired that young man looks.
His tour today. Do you feel good about how the president has reacted to this so far?
I think he's reacted very positive, and I think that the whole U.S. is behind him, along with underlying nations and larger nations overseas. I think they're all supporting his actions.
As we watch the president in New York talking to the people that are firsthand having contact with this, a rescue effort, what is his next step in your view? What should his next step be?
Just keep visible, keep assuring us that things are going to be okay. He's doing everything that is possible. Just be himself. Right now, he hasn't gone, like in a bunker and hidden. He's been out there right there, and he wants to be with us.
How do you rate him so far?
I think he's doing a very good job. I really liked his speech the other night to the country, as well as just the support of the prayer vigils and that sort of thing, being in support of that, and coming down to New York, which I haven't seen yet.
But we're watching it now on the air.
Right, but being visible to the people.
You said it's a tough job. Nobody wants it in a time like this. Is he the right man for this job?
Oh, I think so, very much so. He's, I think, done as good a job as he could do over the past 8 months, considering what he's had to deal with. And I think that he'll come through shining just the way every president of the United States does.
The nation coming together. Aaron, the latest from Dubuque and our cross-country tour will continue, and we'll continue watching.
Jeff, thanks. Thank you very much. We continue to look at tape of the president. We see, and this is tape, we see New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani just off the president's shoulder there. This is tape that the pool shot just a few moments ago. It gets a little difficult here identifying rubble, to be honest, but I do believe that's an area that we have been able to see as he moves, giving a thumbs up to some of the rescue workers. Again, that's Governor Pataki, the New York governor, off to the president's on the left side of your screen. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and obviously an official with New York's bravest, New York City Fire Department. Certainly no one would quarrel with that this week, would they? That they are New York's bravest. Some 200 firefighters still missing in the rubble. This is, again, tape shot by a very small pool of reporters that have been allowed to travel with the president today. Some of that has to do with security. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the president was very insistent that his visit be at worst minimally disruptive. Any presidential visit anywhere is disruptive. Richard Roth is down on the ground. Richard, come on in.
Yes, Aaron, work is going on right very near the president. You can see torches, sparks as what's left of the pedestrian bridge to the American Express corporate building is being brought down. They've been working on it for the last few days. It's one of the structures that's still been left up. One can't help noting that at this time in Wall Street, for the thousands of people in the World Trade Towers, this would be a very joyous part of the week. The stock market would have just been closed. It was Friday afternoon, and usually Wall Street in this area, World Trade Center, has been often called a ghost town on weekends, though more people have been moving down here of late, and as we've noted over and over, it is now a different type of ghost town. You have these giant buildings hulking over the president and his entourage in lower Manhattan, and they're just dark, no power. Some are structurally weakened, their fate unknown. And Friday afternoon in New York, not the way it used to be.
No, it's certainly not. Just helping identify some of the other people there, we see New York Senator Charles Schumer facing the camera, basically. And off to the left there was Joe Albaugh, the FEMA director, a longtime friend of President Bush's, and he named him to run the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Again, this is tape shot by the pool. Is Elizabeth Cohn available here or not?
Yeah. Okay.
Elizabeth, have you seen any activity? Is the president going to make his way to the Armory?
Unfortunately, Aaron, I have no idea.
Okay. Elizabeth has been, we see Senator Hillary Clinton, getting a kiss on the cheek from Mayor Giuliani there. They were almost ran against one another. Kelly Wallace, will the president make his way to the Armory?
Well, Aaron, we don't know, again, because the White House keeping everything under wraps a little bit, but we do know that he is expected to go to another location after this one. So we don't know what that location will be, but we do expect him to go somewhere else after spending some time with firefighters and police officers. And I just wanted to bring up something I learned earlier this afternoon that I don't think has been reported just yet. You see the president there alongside Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton. I was speaking to former President Bill Clinton's spokeswoman earlier today. Of course, we know that the former president, along with Senator Clinton, attending the National Prayer Service in Washington, D.C. And to show you how this really hits home, apparently, according to the spokeswoman, Chelsea Clinton was 12 blocks away at the time of Tuesday's attack, and that she apparently has a friend who was working in one of the towers, one of the Trade Center buildings, and that she and her friend joined countless other New Yorkers racing away from the downtown area shortly after 9 o'clock in the morning. And apparently, according to the former president's spokeswoman, President Clinton, hearing about this, obviously concerned, but he was a father first and foremost. He was concerned about getting in touch with daughter Chelsea. He couldn't get in touch with her for a while, and he was most gratified when he was finally able to talk with her. And then, of course, we know that the former president was in Australia, made his way back to New York, and that he and Chelsea decided, as New Yorkers, according to the spokeswoman, they wanted to go down to the area and talk to New Yorkers and try and do everything they could to comfort those people grieving. I thought that was rather extraordinary. Again, it shows you how this really hits home.
That's remarkable. It's remarkable that it happened, and it's frankly, I think, somewhat remarkable that we hadn't heard it until this point, given how much is out there. Charlie Rangel, congressman from Harlem, with the president, and then just in front of Mr. Rangel, Jerry Nadler, also a congressman from the Upper West Side of, I believe that's right, the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It's, as you would expect, it's all very cordial. These are not political moments. New York City is a very democratic town. And voted heavily Democratic in the election, as did the state. But this is not a political moment, and the entire delegation is certainly welcomed with the president today.
And Aaron, a very Democratic town and a Democratic state, but with a Republican mayor and a Republican governor.
Yes, indeed. It is a Republican mayor, and think back all those, what seems like a lifetime ago in many ways, to Tuesday. Tuesday was Election Day. Mayor Giuliani is ending his term limits make it impossible for him to run again. And so it was election day to begin the process of choosing his successor. That election was canceled, and I saw this morning it's now been rescheduled, and I can't pull out the date from my brain here, but I know it's in a couple of weeks, I think, to see who will replace him. A couple of Republicans in the race, but at this point, I think it would seem more likely, without predicting any outcome or suggesting I'm doing that, that Mayor Giuliani will give up office to a Democrat. The mayor, as I said earlier, has generally been given, I think, very, very high marks for his handling of this crisis. He has been, as he often is, very visible out there when things go bad or things go well in the city. It doesn't get much worse than this, and he has been tireless out there. We expect in another few seconds or so to get another one of the pool reports from David Gregory. David is the pool correspondent who is traveling with the president today, and he will be telling all of the other reporters and us what he is seeing.
This is David Gregory with the president in Lower Manhattan, who continues to survey the damage at what they're calling Ground Zero. We are within sight of where the Twin Towers stood. The president has been working a rope line surrounded by throngs of policemen, search and rescue crews, firemen, many of them getting on the bulldozers that they had been using to clear the debris, to take a picture, to wave at the president. We understand now that the president is actually going to stand on some of the rubble, grab a bullhorn, and make a statement. Some of these men have been chanting USA, USA, and don't let them get away with any of this. The cheering you're hearing is the president now with a bullhorn in his hand as he is standing aboard some rubble, his arm around a fireman with soot on his face. You can hear the chant. Listen to this. The president about to speak now. Listen in.
Got it. I want you all to know. Oh, you can't go any louder. I want you all to know that America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people who died from us here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn, that make a stand with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of it soon. The nation sends its love and compassion to everybody who is here. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for making the nation proud. And may God bless America.
You can hear the chants that continue as the president climbs down off the rubble, grabbing a small American flag and waving it in the air. This crowd here clearly loving it. It's an amazing scene, and as the pictures ultimately get fed back, everyone will be able to see what we are seeing now, a completely electric crowd of people determined to overcome this as the president and the throng of workers are surrounded by complete destruction. At one point, as you heard, some of the workers who were about maybe 50 yards away from the president said, "We can't hear you." The president beckoned back, "I can hear you." And he said, quote, "The people who knocked down these buildings are going to hear all of us." That's the latest with the president as he tours the destruction in Lower Manhattan. I'm David Gregory.
Well, that is about as memorable a scene. I don't make predictions out here, but I'll make this one. I think you probably just saw what's going to be the front page picture in your morning paper tomorrow, the president with a bullhorn or an American flag in his hand, or both, talking to that group of rescue workers. I can't wait to see now the pictures, the lower level pictures. Again, this is tape of the pool of the president at the scene with members of the congressional delegation and New York City officials as well. These are familiar faces now to many of you, and should be, given how much focus has been on the city, this small area, really, a relatively small area of New York City, but how important it is to the city, how symbolic it is about the country. Wall Street, which will open again on Monday at 9:30 after being closed since Tuesday morning, the longest such closure ever. We expect the president to, well, before I do that, if Kelly Wallace up on the roof is still able to hear me. Kelly, I hope you were able to see that in your monitor. I know what that monitor is like up there. Have you ever seen anything like that before?
I have never seen anything like it. As I watched and listened with you, I was just thinking, what an extraordinary moment. There, the president, as you noted, holding a bullhorn, and the chanting, USA, USA, don't let him get away with it. You know, Aaron, we've been reporting that many people hope the president coming here would be sort of a morale booster for these firefighters and these search and rescue teams. Clearly, it appears that that is exactly what happened. It probably, though, Aaron, was a bit of a morale booster for this president, who is obviously facing the most difficult challenge of his only 9-month-old presidency, and that is, of course, balancing an absolute tragedy, trying to comfort the nation, as well as focusing on the investigation and trying to make the difficult decisions about next steps, military options, working with the international community, in his words, to whip out terrorism. So this likely to be a very memorable experience for the president. And Aaron, as we've all been reporting, one of really the most incredible stories here, and certainly one of the toughest is the stories of all those firefighters and police officers who were going into those buildings as all the people working in those buildings were coming down. I know I was on Tuesday not too far from the buildings talking to people who got out, and many people saying that they remember coming down the stairs and firefighters, many very young firefighters going up, and people would cheer, and of course many people very, very upset because many of those same firefighters are now some of the missing. And the president even talking about that in his speech earlier at the prayer service. Aaron, you heard that when he said, talking about all the names that we're learning, and he said they are the names of rescuers, the ones whom death found running up the stairs and into the fires to help others. And obviously many of those firefighters and rescue workers out there certainly concerned about their colleagues and comrades. So obviously a very important moment for those firefighters and rescue workers. Obviously an important moment for the president too. Aaron?
Yeah. I was thinking about the president's morale as you were. Presidents, as you and Judy both know, you've covered them, live in a kind of bubble, and it must have been good for him. Judy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I read I think it was a New York Times this morning, someone who saw those firefighters going up the stairs at the Trade Center as he was coming down, and thinking later it was a ladder to heaven. That phrase has stuck in my mind. And just, again, thinking about the people, the president getting a boost, in a way, if you will, from meeting with these people. I don't think we can underestimate how important it is to those people on the ground working so hard to see the President of the United States coming in their midst, if only for a few minutes or an hour or half an hour, whatever it is, to shake their hands, to congratulate them, just to do a thumbs up. It must be just an extraordinary lift, provide an extraordinary lift for them to have him there.
Well, meeting a president under any circumstance is not routine. And meeting a president or seeing the president in this circumstance must be something else. It must be something. And goodness knows, these men and women down there have been working long and difficult, and today very uncomfortable days. And any morale boost they can get, much appreciated. Richard Roth has been down there as this group moves through. Richard?
Yes, Aaron. Normally I'm at the United Nations. I guess I'm struck by the fact that here we are again in a year ending in '01 and a Bush in the White House, and the talk, the rhetoric, the language from the National Prayer Service in Washington, and some of the rallying around the flag that we and you saw just now. Certainly very similar to the Persian Gulf War and his father's conflict, when President Bush says this conflict was begun on the times and terms of others and will end, in a way, at an hour of our choosing. He's certainly setting the table for some form of military action to come, and certainly the firefighters and the rescue workers who are feverishly clawing through the rubble will back him to the hilt. There's been 10,000 tons of rubble already removed, a lot more still left there, some of which the president was standing on.
The president.
Aaron,
go ahead, Judy. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, listening to Richard, I'm reminded I was talking earlier today at the cathedral prayer service with Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham, and he was saying he thinks the American people are ready for what comes next. The
White House. Let's see if the president actually gets off.
Is just right outside of Washington.
That's true, but on the other hand, in the let's break the pattern just in case any bad guys are trying to do something, this would be a break in the pattern.
Well, I think that's what it is. And then he can take the helicopter from there, or it's almost as quick to drive to the White House from Hagerstown, Maryland.
Well, the president steps off the plane. Either that or they have the winner of the George Bush look-alike contest stepping off this aircraft. It's very clearly the president. So the plane transporting President Bush back from New York lands at Hagerstown Regional Airport, probably the first and perhaps only time that this airport will receive this much attention. Nonetheless, the president, after extensive appearances around New York City, including meeting with the widow of a man who died in the World Trade Center calamity. He did that without cameras, without any photographs around, so far as we know. So, where the president is headed, we do not know. Being reporters like to speculate, and our speculation, clearly labeled as such, is that he's probably going up to Camp David. Now, I'm not sure, Ed, was he stepping into a helicopter?
No, he got into the helicopter, into Marine One.
So it's just a break in the pattern, for whatever reason. The president is back from New York, gone to Hagerstown, Maryland, steps aboard a helicopter, and as we're told, in fact, this just in, that the White House says that he is indeed going to Camp David. Now, as you may recall, that on the advice of the security people, including the Secret Service, Vice President Dick Cheney, quietly, but the word got out, went up to Camp David. The idea was, let's don't have the president and the vice president working in the same location. Now we have the president going to Camp David. It may be that we'll hear that Vice President Cheney is going to be operating out of the White House overnight and into tomorrow. We just don't know. Well, now, Ed Brad is here to tell us a little bit about some of the other victims of this week's devastating events. Ed, let's go to that.
Well, Dan, as the casualty count continues to climb, we're learning more about those who are lost. They've become more than numbers, more than statistics. They have names, they have faces, and they have a history. On American Flight 77, which crashed into the Pentagon, James Ferguson, age 39, from Washington, D.C. He worked for National Geographic. Joining him on that trip was co-worker Ann Judge, age 49, from Great Falls, Virginia. The two were accompanying teachers and students on a field trip to the Channel Island Marine Sanctuary in California. Edmund Glazer, age 41, from Los Angeles, killed on American Flight 11, the first to crash into the World Trade Center. He was the chief financial officer of MRV Communications. His company has set up a college fund in his memory for his young son. Another on that flight, Sonia Morales Pupola, age 58, from Dover, Massachusetts. She was a former ballet dancer. Finally, also on Flight 11, Barbara Keating, age 72, from Palm Springs, California. She was active in the Big Brother, Big Sister organization. She had 5 children, and she had survived 2 bouts of breast cancer. Dan, there's so many more victims, so many more faces we'll be seeing in the coming days, and they all have stories, they all have names, and we'll be putting their names to their faces.
That woman, 5 children of her own, active with the Big Brothers and Big Sisters. She'd beaten cancer twice, and a victim of this. Well, stories continue to emerge out of this week's disaster, uplifting stories, including those about workaday Americans doing extraordinary deeds for their fellow citizens. Harold Dow has been with some of them.
New Yorkers are known, of course, for their diversity.
Computer programmer. Import diamonds. I'm in marketing.
But today, these men and women have something powerful in common. They all needed to help.
What are you doing? You're not volunteering? I'm a professor at Hofstra University.
They all needed to do something.
I felt helpless sitting at home, not being able to do anything to help out the people. I felt guilty because I'm alive and people are dead.
I just didn't want to be alone, and I'm not alone here.
No, it's the first time since this happened that I actually feel hopeful and you know, love and togetherness.
Perishables, all the fresh fruit that we got in today.
Fresh fruit is over there.
But it's not only New Yorkers who are feeling this urgent need to be needed. Why'd you come here, though?
Just be a part of it and get put to work and help out any way we could.
These 3 Iowans, James, Bernie, 18 years old, and Joe, 20, piled into their car on Wednesday and headed east.
Our friends grabbed us some chips and pop, and we piled in his car. And
Joe didn't even tell his own mother of their plans.
she'll be scared, and that's the reason I didn't tell her, is just not to worry her. Not that I didn't think she wouldn't approve, just that I didn't want to add to the things that she has to think about.
Getting here was no easy feat. After 22 hours of driving, they slept at a Red Cross shelter. A long walk, a subway trip, and a bus ride later, they finally made it to this volunteer location in the basement of the Holy Trinity Church on Manhattan's West Side. It was your hope to actually volunteer at Ground Zero.
Yeah, that was the original goal.
Like many New Yorkers, these 3 young men wanted to go to the belly of the beast, thinking that was where they were most needed.
Shovel, rubble, anything. Do anything. Anything at all.
But after less than an hour of pitching in, they realized they can help those rescue workers from a few miles uptown.
Since we came here, that's all changed, and we're really glad I think we feel privileged we just got to help out, period.
There are volunteer operations like this springing up all over the city. The Red Cross says thousands of volunteers have signed on, and they've already raised in excess of $20 million.
The love that has come out, and in just this short period of time, we've collected over $80,000 in cash donations at this location.
You're talking about people who just happen to walk up, write checks, and donate money.
It's anybody from walking up, giving us $1, to people who are writing checks for $5,000 to the Red Cross.
We had a homeless man come by yesterday and empty his cup into our box.
Dave Servini started this shelter because, like everyone, he wanted to do something.
I went down to the Red Cross on Tuesday at about 5:30, and only in New York, there are literally thousands of people in the street, and there's a girl standing waving a piece of paper saying, "Volunteer here, it's a great way to meet somebody, find the love of your life." You know, among all the tragedy that was happening, there was all this like love pouring out.
Next thing he knew, Dave was the head of a bustling volunteer drive. With the help of the local radio station where he works, this site had become a major drop-off for clothing, shoes, medical supplies, and food.
And we literally had hundreds of people lining up asking to volunteer. How can we volunteer? And so it just snowballed into this amazing, amazing thing. And you know, I hope that spirit stays alive, because they're going to be digging out for a long time, and this is a wound that's going to be open for a long time, and it's something that brings us all together. It's nothing like walking out in the streets of New York City and seeing people being really polite to each other.
When looking for heroes, look no further than the firefighters, determined to keep digging at great risk of themselves. Carol Maureen reports that New York's bravest are preparing to say goodbye to someone who was uniquely their own.
For the past 48 hours, the two worlds of Father Michael Judge have come here to mourn him. He was the chaplain to the fire department of the city of New York for over a decade. He did not just pray for firefighters, he went with them.
He had his own car, he had his what do they call it, the light on top, the red light, and he'd go through his sirens to get to places. He was up every night.
When something like that happened, did he always just shoot to the scene?
Yes, yeah, he was in charge of that. He couldn't get there fast enough.
The parish of Father Judge was St. Francis of Assisi on the north side of 31st Street, directly across from Engine 1 Ladder Company 24 on the south side of the street. For Father Judge, there was no separation.
He was there for everybody. I mean, he lived across the street, but he pretty much, you know, he lived here too.
I saw him come into this firehouse many times, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, run down. Hadn't eaten in probably a day and a half, 2 days. But you know what? If he went back to his room over here and the phone rang, he'd be leaving 10 minutes later.
When you had a particularly bad time on a fire or a disaster, right, would he keep track of where you were and what you were doing?
Oh yeah, he knew. You know, he's a God's man. He always knew where you were.
Ladder Company 24 raced out of the firehouse to the World Trade Center right after the first plane struck the North Tower. Father Judge went with them.
He volunteered to go there. He wasn't told to go there. He responded as a volunteer to go there.
And he blessed you before he left?
He blessed everybody in the firehouse.
Father Judge was always with firefighters for their marryings and buryings, their weddings and their wakes.
There was a grace about the way he went through things, and you can that's how you accept. He taught us how to accept death that way, gracefully and peacefully.
He didn't preach, he wasn't pushy in his beliefs, he was kind and tender, and it just made you want to be a good person.
On Tuesday morning, Father Judge was at the scene while both fires were burning. What did you see him doing when you last saw him?
He was standing there blessing everybody, saying prayers, I'm sure, to himself like he always did.
He did?
He prayed for everybody.
And as he was praying, the towers collapsed. He was taken out of the rubble by the men he served, cradled in their arms.
God took Michael Judge, the first firefighter that we lost here, because God wanted to test us. And he says, you don't have Michael with us, but take the faith that he gave us, and he gave it to us. And I want to say thank you to Michael for what he gave us, and he will get this department and this city through this.
Father Judge belonged to two brotherhoods, firefighters and Franciscans. Do you think Father Judge expected to die this way?
I do not think he expected to die this way. He just expected to die, but he was always ready to die this way. And he was always putting himself in danger for others. He never worried about himself, never for a minute.
You knew Father Judge well?
Oh, yeah. I've known him for 25 years when I was a college student, Siena College in Loudonville, upstate New York. And so I was thinking about becoming a lawyer. He says, well, a lawyer, forget it. Become a happy priest. Come and join the Franciscans. This is the prayer that he wrote, that he meant all the time. He says, Lord, take me where you want me to go. Let me meet who you want me to meet. Tell me what you want me to say, and keep me out of your way.
Father Mike was more than just words, and there, Jimmy, you're doing a good job today, and I'll see you later, be careful. Father Mike was not like that. When Father Mike touched you, you were touched by somebody very special. You were touched by a person that sincerely cared for you. Sincerely, whether you're a fireman, a policeman, somebody on the street, Father Mike cared for everybody. Nobody did not like Father Mike. He would want everybody to forgive those persons for whatever has wronged them in their lives, whatever they believe. He wouldn't want anybody to harbor hate towards that. He would never seek a revenge on anybody or on a country. He wouldn't be like that.
It was another disaster 5 years ago where Father Judge offered consolation to the families of those killed in the crash of TWA Flight 800. He said to them what he probably would say to us now.
You have given so many around the world courage and strength by your perseverance and your love. I have been a recipient, a large recipient of your goodness, your faith, and for your love. My life, like yours, was changed. It'll never be the same. But I'm grateful for the change, and I thank you for the gift. May God now bless us.
On this National Day of Remembrance, it's fitting to reflect not only on what was lost, but also on what was found. Ed Bradley has more about that, Ed.
Dan, within hours of the attack, New Yorkers rediscovered something we've always had, if we don't always show it, and that's a sense of what it means to be a community. All over Manhattan, people showed up to pitch in wherever they could. One volunteer firefighter said, "This is more than a donation of time and effort. This is part of a brotherhood." And while sirens blared, an impromptu chorus gathered on the steps of Lincoln Center.
We have food and medical.
Medical over here.
More food. We've got the food.
We're getting help from Pennsylvania and Connecticut and New Jersey to deal with specialized needs.
New York is going to be here tomorrow morning, and it's going to be here forever.
New York's volunteers are out there, Dan, and they say that they'll be there until this crisis.
Terror. They were acts of war.
It's one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. We're all brothers. We all got to stick together.
This is 6 Eyewitness News, continuing coverage of an American tragedy.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Gene Patterson.
And I'm Lori Tucker. Today was a national day of mourning, and people across the nation pulled together.
People packed churches across the country. President Bush attended services at the National Cathedral in Washington, along with former presidents, members of Congress, and the cabinet.
Then the president flew to New York City, where he toured the disaster site. He also met with rescuers and with family members of the victims.
And the president signed an order allowing as many as 50,000 members of the military reserve to go on active duty. Breaking news nationally, we will immediately go back to ABC's coverage in New York. Right now, Jeff Morrell from Lower Manhattan with the latest developments.
3 days after terrorists felled the Twin Towers, federal authorities have made their first arrest. Sources tell ABC News investigators do not believe the man they are holding was directly involved in the suicide missions, but may be a material witness. He was one of 10 suspicious passengers detained at New York airports last night. The other 9 were released this morning. But this man is said to have links to a relative of Osama bin Laden.
There's enough evidence for us to keep him in custody. That's all I will tell you.
Meanwhile, another night of searching has produced no signs of survivors. Not since Wednesday morning has anyone been pulled from this concrete coffin alive. But rescue crews aren't giving up. Though exhausted, they seem re-energized after a visit this afternoon from President Bush. The president was mobbed by rescue workers as he surveyed the devastation. On behalf of the nation, he thanked them for their heroic effort to find survivors.
I want you all to know that America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn.
Before leaving New York, the president visited the Lexington Avenue Armory. There he met privately with some of the families whose loved ones are among the 5,000 still identified as missing. Just a few blocks away at Union Square, the unofficial memorial to the victims, hundreds of sympathetic New Yorkers gather in silence on this National Day of Prayer and Remembrance. Now, more than 10,000 tons of debris have been removed from this site, but as of yet, no sign of the black boxes from the downed planes. Just to make sure that they haven't been accidentally hauled away, at a landfill in Staten Island, FBI agents are going through the debris piece by piece. But so far, they have only found human remains. Reporting live from Lower Manhattan, I'm Jeff Morrell, ABC News. Now back to you.
All right, thank you, Jeff. By the way, the USNS Comfort is now in the New York harbor. The Navy hospital ship came in tonight to provide a rest area for relief workers.
Well, also tonight, a local family continues to hope for good news as they wait on word from their missing loved one. No one has heard from William Anthony Carnes since Sunday. He worked for Marsh Insurance on the 97th floor of the World Trade Tower #1. Tony's family plans to head to New York this weekend, hoping for answers.
Really, that you just simply have to keep the faith, and until you know something positive, you have to hope for the best, and then be prepared for the worst.
Now, Joe is just one of hundreds of families still awaiting word on their loved ones. Latest figures in New York show that almost 4,800 people are now unaccounted for.
The family of Rob Lenore remains in New York tonight. Rob's mother and father of West Knoxville say he is still missing. Rob was working in the World Trade Center building on Tuesday. Friends of the Lenores talked with the family earlier today and say they are relying on faith.
Either Rob is alive and God is with him in his fear and his pain, or Rob is with God. And there's tremendous peace in either of those.
As we told you last night, Rob's name has appeared on a website as a survivor, but the Lenore family says it wasn't an official list, and they say Rob would have notified someone if he was alive. The attack on the Pentagon Tuesday took the life of a woman whose extended family lives here in Knoxville. Sandra Marie White, a civilian employee with the Army, is among those killed when the hijacked airliner crashed into the building. Mrs. White's sister-in-law is Frances Hall. She operates a Knoxville public relations firm, Hall Communications.
Well, there are some glimpses of normalcy in our region. Tonight, students played high school football. But it wasn't just another Friday night. WAT's Adrian McLean joins us in the newsroom to share some of the emotion. Adrian?
Gene, this week has been nothing short of a roller coaster ride, but fans came out tonight in search of something to smile about. While the competition was fierce on the field, hearts united to honor all those who have suffered through these awful attacks.
Root for the home team. In this case, blue and white shines bright at Gibbs High School. But only steps away, sitting in the shadow, a fragile reminder.
And it shows just how much we can come together and be a team, and how that even though all of this has happened, we're going to get through it.
It helps take your mind off of it, and you get to forget just for a little while.
It's time to pick ourselves up. That's the feeling among fans and players as they attempt to divert attention from disaster.
It's exciting to be here. I know that we ought to be mourning what happened, but at the same time, as President Bush says, we got to go on with our life. So that's part of what we're doing tonight, I think.
We're going to have to move on, and I guess this kind of helps get your mind off of it a little bit. But if they would have canceled it, I would have understood why.
Some people feel conflicted about the decision to play, but games across East Tennessee celebrate unity to cope with heartache.
But they decided to have it, and my son is here, and I'm with my son.
Time together, helping to heal the soul.
Now, some of the people we spoke with say these football games are a way for the community to get together and support each other. Gene?
You mentioned some folks are conflicted. Was there any sense of protest about the decision to play the game tonight?
Gene, it's really a tough call. Some feel now is a time of mourning and a game is really inappropriate. But even those who disagreed with the decision still came out. Because really, if we've learned anything this week, it's that time is very precious. Gene?
Indeed. Thank you.
Rural Metro and Blount and Knox counties are on alert tonight, ready to assist the rescue and recovery efforts in New York. Earlier today, the ambulances could be seen lined up with the stars and stripes on every vehicle. 17 staff members are on call, ready to go if they're needed. President Bush has ordered 50,000 military reserve men and women to leave their civilian jobs for active duty. Liz Vale is a Knoxville police officer and a reserve naval officer. Vale is already getting packed and is preparing to leave her K-9 partner. She is with a reserve unit trained to take care of wounded troops.
Psychologically, I've done a lot of praying for everybody, no matter who it is, because, you know, it should never have happened, but it did. But now we've just got to take care of ourselves.
The Knoxville Police Department does have a plan to compensate for officers called to serve in the armed forces.
Well, airports across the country are open tonight, but many passengers spent the day waiting as many airports were still not running at quite normal capacity. And security remains very tight at every airport in the U.S., and that includes McGee-Tyson. Most passengers we heard from say they're not complaining, though, about the extra security or the delays.
When she asks you if anyone else has helped you pack the bags, it gets to be much more significant a question.
Now, the best way to be prepared at airports is to keep your patience, is by arriving early, and you should expect delays. The good news is that at McGee-Tyson, there are more flights leaving each day. The new carry-on restrictions and drop-off regulations may cause you some confusion. If you have any questions about security or flights, call McGee-Tyson Airport at that number there, 342-2900. Again, 342-2900.
Well, knowing that many of you have questions about how to deal with the attacks, WATE assembled a panel of counselors tonight. From 5 until 8, they took questions from you on how to talk to your children or your students and ways to cope with this yourself. Well, the phones, as you see there, stayed busy for all 3 hours they were here. Thank you for calling in, and we certainly hope we were able to be of some help. And beginning tomorrow at 6 p.m., we will be hosting a telethon with all proceeds going to the Red Cross Disaster Fund. The telethon will be open from 6 to 11:30 p.m. on Saturday and on Sunday. We're going to have a lot of guests, some local celebrities, many people, leaders in town just gathering to try to help and send money, because that's really what's needed right now.
And what we need on this weekend is for you to tune in and make your pledges for us. Sure. Well, now we want to tell you about another outpouring of support from East Tennessee.
Yeah, this time it's to help people right here at home. High school students have set another record in our Six Shares Football Challenge. This week, it was Powell versus Halls. Students at Powell collected more than 78,000 pounds of food this week. That's almost 69 pounds per student. Add that to the food collected by Halls, and it comes to 116,557 pounds of food from this week's competition. And it all goes to Second Harvest Food Bank to feed the hungry in East Tennessee.
Well, that is true. You know, last week we were at Farragut-Bearden game, and I thought there was no way anybody would surpass that amount. But
108,000 back then.
Yeah, those kids did a great job tonight.
They did. Everybody did.
President Bush gets in his first in-person look, at the devastation in New York.
When we come back, we'll take you to Ground Zero, where the commander-in-chief took a somber walk.
And the president says America will need its NATO allies for any military action. Some NATO countries are more than willing to help.
6 Storm Team Weather, brought to you by...
One of thousands still missing after terrorists took down the World Trade Center. His brother-in-law says the waiting and wondering is almost unbearable.
It's tough. Not knowing, and knowing that there's nothing...
The X, Y, or Z, and I'm here to help you. And the Taliban immediately think,
CIA. So this is not easy work.
But just to try to explore the complexity of this, if we were to turn to one of the moderate Arab states we consider allies, and ask them to go after Osama bin Laden, does that not put some risks on their shoulders, given the support for radical Islam in some of their own countries?
Well, I think it does, but I also think that the mood in those states has dramatically changed in the past 2 or 3 years.
How so?
Well, I think the Millennium bombing plot, the effort to ring in the new year in a, quote, Islamic way, that Osama bin Laden's networks attempted to stage, really galvanized a lot of American allies in the Middle East and showed them that if they didn't fight this kind of terror, they themselves would become the victims of it. I can only tell you that in previous articles that I've written, I worked very closely with some Middle Eastern intelligence officials who had rather good information about what Osama bin Laden was up to and his networks. And that information was enormously helpful in many cases to the Americans.
So the statement that we, the United States or the West, must root and branch terrorism and its supporters within the Arab world, within the Near East, within many other countries. I mean, it sounds as if what you're saying is, without the support of our Arab allies, without their wholehearted support, this is a prescription that can't work.
I don't think you can do it without their wholehearted support, and that, in fact, is part of the problem. Wholehearted, because some of our Arab allies want to have things both ways. On one hand, they want to work with us quietly, secretly, against terrorism in their own countries and directed at the West. And on the other hand, they want to be, quote, on the right side of the street, the Arab street. That is, they want to identify with the causes that Osama bin Laden and people like him attempt to tap into.
So when you hear Pakistan, for instance, say, we're on your side, we utterly condemn this, we will help you, ought we to take that with a grain of salt?
I think we ought to be hopeful that they mean what they say, but once again, having worked there, Pakistan is a country whose secular government, they are even embarrassed about calling themselves that. But this is a government that is deeply torn. It is very full of factions and sympathizers with the Islamists. Their intelligence service is penetrated. It's going to be very hard for them to pull this off.
All right, let me turn now to Zoe Chaffetz, and I want to start with a specific subject about which you wrote, and that has to do with the issue of airline security in the United States. We've heard it probably 1,000 times said that, you know, that we now have to become, every American airline has to become El Al, which hasn't had a hijacking in 30 years. They rigorously search bags, they do interviews. Can we do that?
No, I don't think so.
Why not?
First of all, Israel has only one airport, has only one international airport, only one airline, only several airlines traveling in and out. America has thousands of airports. And besides that, El Al security is not a matter of technique, it's a matter of philosophy. It takes into account that there are potentially dangerous people getting on planes. And it treats people, passengers, as potential suspects or as potential dangers, security dangers.
Well, I don't see, yes.
That will,
we could do that.
At best, that will take hours and hours of preparatory time for flights. It will slow down the American economy. But beyond that, it's not really the issue, because America is a country with tens of thousands of targets. If terrorists find that, if there were security at airports, I mean real security, which would cost a fortune and which would take an enormous amount of effort, but if that were to happen, terrorists would go to the train station. They'd go to the nearest high school. They'd go to the ball game.
It does raise this issue of locking the barn door after the horse is gone. That is, I've seen all these stories of incredibly tightened security at American airports, curbside check-ins and the like, and I have to admit, I thought to myself, yeah, but it's not likely that the next terrorist will do what the last one.
Of course not. There, you know, right now there are buildings all over Manhattan and all over the East Coast and all over the country that are wide open. After the World Trade Center, there's no security in genuine terms.
So you're talking
here.
about somebody walking into Penn Station, which obviously has no
Or Grand
security.
Central, or any place. And you know, the issue is that you can't deal with terrorism. There are probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, Arabs, Muslims, who are prepared to carry out terrorist acts in this country. You can't deal with terrorism by picking them off one at a time. It's an impossibility.
And so instead?
You have to go to the source.
And the source is?
The source, first of all, are the countries that support terrorism, and they are Syria, Iran, and Iraq, and probably Iran and Iraq most importantly, and maybe Syria, because they have the potential to have nuclear weapons.
Zev, when you say we must go to them, what do you mean?
I mean that it's December 8th, 1941, and people are saying, what should we do about Japan? There are 100 million Japanese, there are 100 million Germans. How can we ever conquer these countries? It's impractical. We should fire a missile. We should go after the commander of the Japanese Navy. That's nonsense. America is going to have to go in, dismantle and disarm these insane governments, and the terrorists that they support, or the next attack on this city, or the one after, ask Judy, will be a biological or a nuclear attack, and it won't be 5,000 dead, it will be 500,000 dead.
Mr. Bremer, I think what Mr. Chaffetz is saying, in fact, I'm pretty sure of it, is we have to declare war on the states of Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Is that what we have to do?
Well, I hope not. As I said, I think the inner circle of the focus is going to be on Afghanistan, where I think we will be at war. I think there is something, however, he has said that's very true, which is 20 years ago, the United States government took the lead in developing an international consensus that the use and support of terrorism was no longer acceptable, and we did a pretty good job of building that consensus during the 80s. That has largely been lost during the 90s. And we've got to rebuild that consensus now. We've got to get serious about it when we say that we consider, for example, the countries he named, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. When we say they're terrorist-supporting states, then our policy has to follow that through to the consequences, and we have to insist that our allies agree. For example, our allies have been falling all over themselves to sign commercial agreements with Iran. In fact, we have also got the possibility of putting sanctions on those countries which have been waived by the previous administration and by this administration. Syria has the headquarters of a dozen terrorist groups, known terrorist groups who operate in the open in Damascus, terrorist groups which have killed Israeli and other citizens in just this past year. They operate freely in Damascus. Syria allows more than a dozen terrorist training camps to continue to operate in the Bekaa Valley, though it has been raised with them for more than 15 years. Those kinds of things have simply got to be stopped. And in the end, if they don't stop them, we may have to take military action. But it seems to me that's not the immediate concern now. The immediate concern now is to take some steps that show that we are really serious about terrorism, to take steps which broaden that beyond the immediate targets of Afghanistan and bin Laden, and to create this new international consensus.
Judy Miller, pick up on something that Zev alluded to, that the next time it's not going to be 5,000, but God knows how many. You just co-authored a book on germ warfare. Do you take, and there was a report, I should mention, in an Arab newspaper just yesterday that Osama bin Laden had trumpeted the fact that he says thousands of young supporters of his have studied chemical, biological, nuclear warfare, prepared to martyr themselves for it. Without getting into the assessment of that, do you take seriously the fact that we, the United States, are under potential threat for an attack in the chemical or biological field?
Well, if I didn't take that threat seriously, I wouldn't have written this book. I think that I started out, Jeff, very, very skeptically. I did not believe that biological weapons were a real threat to this country. I thought that all the people issuing these warnings were kind of looking for a new enemy. And the more I looked at the spread of this very dangerous technology and how relatively easy this was to do compared to the enormous expense and difficulty of a nuclear infrastructure that you need to make a weapon, the more of a no-brainer it seemed. And my colleagues and I concluded that this really was the 21st century weapon for what President Bush has called the 21st century wars.
Well, okay. When I stood on the roof here at CNN, 2 miles north of the World Trade Center with my colleague Aaron Brown, and looked at the smoke billowing across Lower Manhattan, I will confess to you that one of my thoughts was, suppose they brought something with them on those planes. If that is the case, then is it too alarmist to say we may have to go in and declare war on every state that is harboring groups that have the potential and the willingness to use germ warfare against the West?
Well, you know, I think there are a lot of steps short of that the administration is going to start to take. But the first thing they can really do is make good on the previous administration's promise to, quote, drain the swamp. I mean, that was Mike Sheehan's great pledge. He was the former director of counterterrorism for the State Department. And he said, what you have to do to get rid of these networks is drain the swamp in which they live. And under the Clinton administration, I have to say that some progress was made in eliminating the countries that play host to these groups. And now we have to concentrate on the rest of them.
Before I turn to the last question and get a comment from each of you, I want, Zev, for you to take us a little more personally into this issue. You lived in Israel for 30 years. It's a state that has never lived outside of conflict and threat. Do you get used to it? I mean, do you go out at night and put that thought behind you, or is it always with you?
You get used to it, but in the Israeli reality, you mentioned that I lived in Israel for 30 years. I served in the Army for close to 30 years, in the active Army and the reserves. So does everyone. We learn to be careful, and we learn that we have to be proactive. One of the things that is very hard for Americans to do is to stare evil in the face. And if you want to combat evil, if you want to fight Islamic and Arab terrorism, and I don't call them generically terrorism because we're talking about Islamic and Arab terrorism, you have to call them by their proper name, you have to put your finger on where they are, you have to go after them, and you have to finish the job.
But you've also were born in America and live here now. This is a country that is almost in this sense the mirror image of Israel, right, Judy? We've never lived with anything approaching threat, not even in World War II. Can a country like ours learn?
I can tell you that if we don't learn in this country, if America doesn't learn, there will be disastrous consequences. And I don't think America needs to learn. The governments, the armies of Iran and Iraq and Syria are not so formidable. Israel is a 5 million person state, and it's been fighting these morons successfully for 30, 40, 50 years.
But Zev, you still have suicide bombers, and you have more of them every day.
That's right.
And how is that a victory?
It's the victory. First of all, the victory is that Israel is there, and it's getting bigger and stronger, and richer and more free as time goes on. But the point is that we have to deal with reality, and now reality has showed up in Manhattan. The reality of the Arab and Islamic Middle East is here. You are, as we are, the enemy of these people. And they will do here what they've done in Israel. They will try to kill as many people as possible, and they will do it very efficiently.
Let me turn to the, but before I turn to you, Mr. Bremer, I just want to get from Judith Miller a reaction to that. Chaffetz says the only solution is to go in and dismantle these states.
I don't think that's possible. I mean, my own view, I don't think that it may be necessary. I think these states want ultimately not to be isolated. And if the rest of the world means what it says about joining America in this campaign, I think they will find themselves truly isolated, and that hopefully the use of military force will not be necessary. But Jeff, I want to say one more thing. I think it's very dangerous. We're on a very slippery slope here. The terrorists win if we become the enemy that we are fighting. If we live in fear, if we do violent things that kill innocent people, we become them, and they will gloat at this victory. So it's very difficult to fight on one hand and maintain our democratic values on the other.
Mr. Bremer, I want to bring you in and ask what I suppose is in one sense, the toughest question. How will we know when we've won? We knew how we won in Japan. They surrendered on a aircraft carrier. I remember, seeing those pictures in history. How will we know when we've won this war?
Well, first of all, fighting terrorism is more like fighting crime. Terrorism has been here since recorded history began, and it's always going to be here. So there is no final victory in the sense that terrorism is stamped out any more than you can stamp out crime. A legitimate goal for foreign policy is to get terrorism down to a point where it does not dominate our foreign policy, where we conduct our relations with other nations on other bases of political and diplomatic interchange, economic interchange, free trade, and so forth. But we need to be a bit realistic. We're not going to eliminate terrorism. It's always going to be there. There always will be vulnerabilities. And as Judy Miller said, The real challenge for a country like America, the great strength of America, is an ability to wage this kind of a war while protecting our civil liberties that we have fought and died for over 200 years, and to keep those in balance with the measures we're now going to have to take, security measures we're now going to have to take. I think we can do that. We've done it before. We are a great and resilient nation, and we will come through this.
But let me just pursue this analogy, false though it may be. When we defeated Japan and Germany, we killed countless hundreds of thousands of their civilians as well as military people. We occupied their capitals. And within a relatively short amount of time, Germany and Japan became functioning, healthy democracies allied with the West. There's no chance, is there any chance that that could possibly happen with states like Iran, Iraq, and Syria? I mean, even if it were militarily possible?
Well, I don't think you can generalize. I think Iran is already a democracy. They have elections there. You can't say the same thing about Iraq, and Syria has basically phony elections. So you've got to look at each of them individually in terms of their culture and their history and their background. I'm not advocating, I share Judy's concern. I'm not advocating that we go to war with everybody who's in the neighborhood. I think if we act vigorously in the narrow case of Afghanistan and the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, we will find that we can change the whole dynamic of the region, where people will begin to respect that we are really serious, we really mean business, and if we can get our allies to stand with us, we'll find that we can get a lot of things done without having to use force in the second ring, that I described, where we go after these other countries.
So, Chaffetz, you were shaking your head when Mr. Bremer was offering that. I'm assuming that you don't agree with that assessment.
No, I don't agree. I think that going into Afghanistan is exactly the wrong thing to do. Afghanistan is a sideshow. It's a remarkably difficult country to accomplish anything in. And it's a country which doesn't, aside from providing safe haven for the Taliban, for bin Laden, doesn't really pose a major threat in itself. The real threats, America needs to go after the real threats. It can't pretend. I mean, it's been convenient up until now to play all sorts of games about what's dangerous and what isn't. The World Trade Center ought to tell everybody that it is too dangerous to allow rogue nations, whether it's Iran or Iraq or Syria or perhaps Libya or others, to have weapons of mass destruction, because they will be used not just by terrorists whom they harbor, but by the governments themselves.
And just to pursue this, because we're down to the last couple of minutes, if we go to war with Iran, Iraq, Syria, maybe Libya, what is to prevent? It seems to me if there's one thing that will guarantee a terrorist with the capability to unleash germ warfare to do it, it's that. So do we win under those circumstances?
The beginning of wisdom in this conflict is to put aside past conceptions and to understand that there's no need to be so pessimistic. If America could defeat Germany and Japan, it can defeat Syria and Iran. And if the Iranians and the Syrians or the Iraqis have weapons, better that whatever happens now and not 3 years from now.
Judith Miller, I want to give you the last word, because you were shaking your head when Zev was, at least we didn't book a panel where everyone was in agreement. So I'm going to ask you to cap this by answering the question that I asked Mr. Bremer. How will we know when we've won? What does it mean to win?
I think I have to agree with Jerry Bremer that it's we'll never be able to just declare victory, but I think you will see that there will be no more attacks like the attacks we've seen. And you know, nobody's a soothsayer. We cannot determine how this long struggle will come out, but I do know that it's going to be, I think it's going to be a very long struggle indeed.
Tough conversation for a Friday night, but this has not been the usual week we have been used to. Thanks very much to my guest, Judith Miller of the New York Times, Zev Chaffetz of the New York Daily News, and then Washington L. Paul Bremer, former Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism in the Reagan administration. And Mr. Bremer, we hope that the miracle can happen with your colleagues. Thank you all for joining us. Aaron Brown, back to you.
Jeff, thank you very much. the bottom of the hour now. Let's take a look quickly at some of the latest developments for those of you who may just be joining us. Some things have changed along the way as well. Searchers have found the cockpit voice recorder from the hijacked plane that crashed in Pennsylvania on Tuesday. Much information is possible there. Rescuers trying to reach the World Trade Center through a train tunnel that goes under the Hudson River from New Jersey were thwarted tonight when they found that the last 500 feet was flooded to the ceiling. They were hoping that there might be some survivors in the train or in the tunnels on those lower levels, but that is not to be. 2 men said to have detailed knowledge of the terrorist network are taken to New York from Texas tonight. They were taken from an Amtrak train. They were armed with box cutters and without legal ID. And late tonight, the House of Representatives followed the Senate in passing a use of force resolution. It is a resolution that gives the president a green light to use military force to go after the terrorists, the masterminds, and those countries the president believes harbors them. One dissenting vote there. And observances of a National Day of Prayer and Remembrance continue tonight. Earlier, many of the giant marquees along the Las Vegas Strip went dark in tribute to the victims of Tuesday's attack. I want to show you a couple things here. I'm sorry, they're just getting organized a bit. These are pictures we just got of the Ground Zero area. This was shot by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, today. And you see the rescue workers moving in. I think as we get a little, there we go, we get a much better sense of two things, it seems to me: the extent of the damage and the broadness of the damage as well. And you also get a sense of the people who are working there, the fatigue on their faces and the rest. These are pictures that were shot, as we say, by FEMA, as FEMA officials toured the area today. They came in around the time the president came in. Now a series of still pictures. This is in the moments after the first plane hit the first tower on Tuesday. These were taken in tower number 1. As you see people coming down the stairwell trying to get out. Look at on the right side, the woman's face, if you can see it. I think is there one more in this sequence, David? Okay, let's take a look. Again, these were shot shortly after the plane hit on Tuesday in the first of the towers at the World Trade Center. We have, I think, 3 or 4 more of those pictures at our website. You can go to our website at cnn.com. Try and help make people through this time of grief. As you know, Americans today all over the country really came together, big cities, small cities, for a National Day of Prayer and Remembrance. National correspondent Bruce Morton takes a look at all that was said and heard there.
Church services everywhere. America's leadership was at Washington's National Cathedral, but services everywhere. Cleveland, Ohio.
We mourn for the many lives lost in a tragedy that remains etched in our minds forever.
Boston, Massachusetts.
Look with compassion on the whole human family, and especially on those who lost their lives this week.
Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer.
At the Pentagon, where many lost fellow workers and friends.
May God comfort all of you that are in loss today, and may we wait on Him and renew our strength.
Manchester, New Hampshire. An Islamic service in Sterling, Virginia, near Dulles Airport.
When people accuse you of being terrorist, this is because this is what they were told.
Austin, Texas.
Banish the violence that has been in our midst and the evil that exists around us.
Back at Washington's National Cathedral, the Commander-in-Chief.
This conflict was begun on the timing and terms of others. It will end in a way and at an hour of our choosing.
That service ended with a hymn, a battle hymn. Bruce Morton, CNN, Washington.
This tragedy has been, we suspect, especially difficult for the many millions of Arab Americans in the country. There has been a considerable amount of harassment of them. This is a very difficult time. They, too, in many places in the country, gathered to pray in this National Day of Mourning and Remembrance. CNN's Richard Blystone on the New York Muslim community now.
A community rich in immigrants, sharing the time-honored aim of making it in America. Still on good terms with their old cultures. Still strong in their faith, Islam. Atlantic Avenue, they proudly say, is the oldest Arab community in New York, and as stunned as anyone by Tuesday's carnage.
It's shocking, it's horrible. You feel very bad, you know.
What's different here is fear of taking the blame.
All Arab American and Muslims in this country that resides and live and make their living in this country are as good as American as anyone else that came from all over the world, and they love the American flag just like anyone else, and they have nothing to do against this country, and this is one of the reasons we are living in this country.
Nonetheless, Atlantic Avenue today is keeping a low profile, lest the rash of slurs and slights and insults get more serious. Ahmed Morsi is passing out a letter in Arabic from the New York District Attorney, telling Arabs and Muslims where to call if harassed or attacked, like his own mother on Tuesday.
She was spit at, go back to your country, die, this and all these different slurs and different, my mother.
Islam is a religion of tolerance, says the Imam, Abdul Rahman Tafa, a religion that forbids ignorant wars between nations. Muslims from 22 nations come to pray here. We all feel the pain of what happened, says the Imam, and he asks, please give blood, money, whatever you can to help victims of the disaster. But if the attackers were Muslims pursuing what they saw as a holy war, did Islam attack America? Jihad is for defense and defense only, he says, and anyone who preaches otherwise doesn't know Islam. The Quran says if a man murders another human being, it is as though he killed all humanity. This Friday service ends with special prayers for all those who were killed, including at least 50 Muslims. Richard Blystone, CNN, Brooklyn, New York.
One of the things that seems to be binding all Americans these days, no matter their backgrounds in the aftermath of this tragedy, is a renewed sense of patriotism. We came across a statistic today that just since Tuesday, Kmart and Walmart, these two giant retailers, have sold about 500,000 American flags. Obviously, many other flags have been sold as well. It would seem that many people feel that there is no other place to turn, that the flag is the one thing that connects them all and makes them feel a little bit better in a very difficult time. Here's CNN's Ann McDermott.
You might take this guy for a loony in better days, but these are days of rage.
Our people, this is our people, this is our land, this is our way of life.
And the people below are with him. And in a way, so is Arthur Jagle, who heard and saw things this week he could not take in.
They were unbelievable. I thought that it was just a dream, but it wasn't.
He is glad to know, though, that others are doing what he's doing this day, flying their flags. When they can find them, this man wanted a big one.
Well, unfortunately, it's all they have left.
But Rose Tibbs didn't care what kind of flag she got. Too sad to care.
You know, it breaks your heart. It breaks your heart to think that people have so much anger and hate in their hearts that they could do something like this.
She took her flags back to work, handed them out to her office mates, and then they watched TV. A prayer service was on. People seem to want prayer these days, hoping perhaps that God will shed his grace on them. But America, meanwhile, is opening up its heart and wallet. These radio stations collected more than $100,000 for victim relief in just a couple of hours. And here, too, they show the colors. Something that perhaps seems trivial against a backdrop of so much suffering. But for Michael Maranga, it says what he feels.
We're here, and we're not going away.
Ann McDermott, CNN, Los Angeles.
This week that has been like no other is going to lead to a weekend that is going to be anything but usual as well. There are going to be no Major League Baseball games. All Major League Baseball games have been canceled through the weekend. The National Football League has canceled its games as well, so no games, no football on Sunday. And there will be only a few college games as well. The Emmy Awards were scheduled for Sunday. They've been moved to next month. And the release of a number of movies has also been postponed for the weekend because they're pretty violent, and that seemed pretty inappropriate given all the violence that we've seen. CNN's Beth Nissen now on what New Yorkers are doing to try and escape this tragedy.
For most New Yorkers, it doesn't seem much like the start of a weekend. Still, in a week when so many people who went to work on Tuesday never came home, it was good to see the work week end. Many headed out of town for hastily arranged family gatherings. Jason Spiewak was taking Amtrak to his parents' home in Pennsylvania.
I've just been stirred up all week by the goings-on, and I just want to be close to family and friends.
Bree McCallop was going home to Florida.
I live by myself, and I really just don't want to be here right now. I just don't feel comfortable being here. I don't feel safe.
Almost everyone understood the desire to get away from the unrelenting anguish and distress and fear, to read about and think about something else, anything else.
You'd almost want the new fall season on TV because, it's an escape. Everywhere you look is just inundated with the pictures that you've seen over and over and over, and it's 24/7. And you have to switch to something like Cartoon Network just to escape from it.
In Times Square, hundreds of people lined up in the rain to buy half-price tickets to Broadway shows. Patricia McClellan was trying to get tickets to Beauty and the Beast for her 2 school-aged children.
Trying to pick up their spirits and get them together and get them away from viewing everything that they've been looking at for the last week.
After 4 days of almost unbearable real-life drama, many wanted to see a stage story with a clear resolution, a happy ending.
The theater provides for us a little bit of release, a little bit of relief from what's going on. We can't ever forget what's gone on here in New York with the great tragedy, but it gives us a little bit of a mental vacation.
Those who went to New York City movie theaters seemed in search of the same thing.
It's quite ironic that I'm choosing to go to the movies for 2 hours, considering this is like being in a movie. It's surreal. It's like a Hollywood horror film, and yet I'm looking for a film to kind of just take my mind away from it,
Legions of others just wanted to stay home. Some rented half a dozen videos.
I've never rented a movie before. I just got a membership today because I plan on staying in the house all weekend. I'm not going to do anything because of the incident.
Because of that horrible incident, NFL and college football games, a usual weekend release for thousands of sports-mad New Yorkers, were canceled.
I wish I had the distraction to the release of the football season, but I understand as playing football as myself, the tension of what happened at the World Trade Center, I wouldn't want to play if I was a player.
Not everyone wanted distraction. Some wanted a few hours of quiet to try to cope with the stun and the sorrow.
A lot of people died, and it broke my heart. It literally broke my heart. And I feel like crying right now.
Millions of New Yorkers still need comforting. Many said they plan to attend religious services this weekend, go to temple tonight, Mass tomorrow, or church on Sunday. The Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue has added a second service Sunday to accommodate what Senior Minister Arthur Caliandro expects will be standing room crowds.
I think what people are looking for is sanctuary, a place to be where they're safe emotionally and physically, but also that we're spiritually.
But feeling safe again seems such a long way off for most New Yorkers. So much loss still uncounted. And for most people, nothing they can do except try their best to make it through tomorrow and the next day and a long succession of days after. Beth Nissen, CNN, New York.
We want to button up a little bit of business that we've been telling you about, that the House of Representatives just a short time ago passed the use of force resolution. The Senate had passed it unanimously earlier in the day. The House, working late into this Friday evening, has now done the same, but not quite unanimously. Jonathan Carl, who covers the Congress for us, joins us now and can give us some of what happened in the House chambers. Jonathan, good evening.
Well, Aaron, the House vote, which took place just a short while ago, was 420 to 1. The only dissenting voice was Democrat Barbara Lee of California voting no. All other members of the House of Representatives voting yes, authorizing the president to use all necessary and appropriate force against those responsible for these attacks.
With virtually no dissent, Congress authorized the president to use all necessary and appropriate force against all those tied to the attacks.
For constitutional purposes, it's the same as a declaration of war. There is no constitutional difference between authorizing the president to use this kind of force and saying we declare war.
The hurried vote united conservatives and liberals who usually disagree about military intervention. Paul Wellstone, whose first significant vote as a senator a decade ago was against the use of force against Iraq in the Persian Gulf War, was one of the few to speak before the vote.
It's going to be a long, difficult struggle, but I believe people in our country and people in Minnesota are united in this. But we need to do this the smart way.
Despite the lack of debate, members of both parties had privately objected to a White House request for a more open-ended authorization of force against terrorists. As a result, the resolution passed authorizes the president to use military action specifically, quote, against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons.
It relates to the incident, and there's broad authority relating to the incident. It does not relate to all terrorism every place.
Several key leaders hope to avoid a repeat of the 1964 Tonkin Gulf Resolution, in which Congress, after North Vietnam allegedly attacked U.S. warships, almost unanimously granted President Johnson the authority, quote, to take all necessary measures to prevent further aggression by North Vietnam. Many in Congress came to regret that as the Vietnam War escalated and grew increasingly unpopular.
I would like to know what authority the Federal Reserve...
Now, Aaron, this may be the most widespread authorization of use of force since that Tonkin Gulf Resolution of 1964. But in the Senate, it actually took place without any formal debate whatsoever. The Senate simply went into their vote on this after passing that $40 billion emergency aid package. No vote, no dissenting voices whatsoever on this question of the use of force. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives still at work at this late hour. Right now on the floor of the House, what they're debating is, among other things, a possible aid package for the airline industry, which, of course, has been hit by not only these events, but was in financial difficulties before this even happened. Right now you see Democrat Obey, he is, of course, the top Democrat on the Appropriations Committee, talking about this. This package to aid the airline industry would be $2.5 billion in direct aid, direct cash payments to the airlines, as well as $12.5 billion in loan guarantees. The Congress, the House, hoping to get on record on this tonight before they go off for the weekend, and actually they're not coming back until Wednesday of next week, so they hope to get this done before those financial markets reopen, possibly as soon as Monday, to show that the airline industry, despite its financial dire straits, will have direct support coming from the U.S. Congress.
Jonathan, there are a number of things here to talk about. Let me just start at the end with the airline industry. You talk about direct payments, you're talking about somebody's going to write a check to American, United, Delta, and the rest, pretty much, right?
That's exactly what they're talking about. The airlines would get $2.5 billion in direct cash, and then in addition, you have those $12.5 billion in loan guarantees. And you've had two of the people that have pushed most vigorously for this have been on the Democratic side, Congressman Gephardt, the minority leader, pushing for this, but also Tom DeLay on the Republican side. Broad support for offering direct cash payments for the airline industry because they believe a special industry that has been hit, obviously, especially hard by this tragedy.
And it's not a small amount of money. Is it spread out over a period of time, or does it all go out the door at once?
Well, right now, they are trying to work on some of these details, but this is $2.5 billion in immediate cash payments, and those loan guarantees, I haven't seen the exact language, but my understanding is this is something that would all start happening immediately.
And has anyone sat down and started working a calculator to figure out what the numbers are at this point? Because I'll confess I'm a little lost here. You've got an aid package that's being worked on now, as you just mentioned, and this airline money, there's another couple billion. And you've got the talk of calling up 35,000 reservists. That's a very expensive proposition. They need to be clothed and housed and paid and the rest. Is anybody putting a number on this yet?
Well, you really are not happening. I mean, it's really not happening yet. I mean, it was amazing watching this, Aaron. I watched them as they were debating and trying to put together this aid package. And at first they were talking about numbers of about $11 billion for New York. Then all of a sudden it went to $20 billion. And then with almost the snap of your fingers, after the New York delegation met with the president, it went to $40 billion in aid package. Now they're calling that simply a down payment on what's going to be needed. You see this money about the bailout of the airline industry. I've talked to a number of members today as they were milling about before the vote, and they say, look, this whole question of the Social Security lockbox, that's over. We don't know how much this is going to talk. One prominent Republican predicted that the entire surplus could be blown trying to deal with this problem. So nobody's really sat down and said, what's this going to mean? What are the costs? They're saying whatever the costs are going to be, if we need to go back into deficit spending, we'll do it. You pretty much have a consensus along party lines on that. Even some of those real budget, deficit hawks on the Republican side that are usually, so adamantly opposed to excessive government spending are saying, hey, this is a completely different situation. We have a national emergency here. There are going to be untold defense costs, untold domestic costs in terms of rebuilding the economy in New York and beyond. And they're not really talking about great concern about the deficit anymore. The thing that seemed to be such of paramount concern in Congress just 4 or 5 days ago is now really not much of a concern at all, at least in this immediate aftermath.
Yeah, remember we were talking about surpluses and the rest 4 or 5 days ago. It does seem like a long time ago. Jonathan, thank you. Jonathan Karl, working late tonight at the Capitol as the House of Representatives continues to work on the aid package and the rest. A couple images to show you before we say goodnight here from us. Back to Seattle first. This prayer vigil that has been going on now for an hour or so. And when we first took a look, it seemed to us there was a much smaller number of those votive candles being displayed. As you can see, now there is an enormous number of Seattleites gather out in the Northwest on a Friday in September to pray, to be together, to remember those who have died in this awful week. And we rather suspect to show their support for those men and women who, as we speak, continue to work downtown in New York, down by the World Trade Center or where the Trade Center was, with their heavy machinery and on their hands and knees in some cases, sifting through the debris, looking for signs, listening carefully for any noise, a cell phone ringing, anything that would tell them there is someone there. That is one of the images of a week full of images, and we leave you tonight with a good many other images as well. Most of them, frankly, not very pretty. It has not been that kind of week. But the music underneath them is quite pretty, and that's where we'll say goodnight. We'll see you tomorrow.
I knew nothing about... I first encountered what I thought to be Bigfoot or Sasquatch, as it's called. I was driving up a road late at night, and I thought I made a wrong turn. I backtracked about a quarter mile back the way I had come, and where I had just come from, there was now a staggering smell, like nothing I'd ever smelled before in my life, as pungent as a skunk, but different than a skunk. The hair stood on the back of my neck, and as I sat there in the silence, I could hear what sounded to be like really heavy footsteps just at the edge of my range of vision. I couldn't see anything, but I could smell this terrible smell, and I could hear this kind of ominous sound. So even though I didn't see Sasquatch, I believe it was a Sasquatch. I came back after that night convinced that Sasquatch was real. Bigfoot is either the most complex hoax that's ever been perpetrated on mankind, or it's a real animal. The search for Bigfoot is like the search for the Holy Grail. People really want to score that big payoff and find Bigfoot when no one else has.
Stand by. The Earth 105 105-minute music suite starts in 15 minutes.
More rock and roll classics, more often.
Earth 105.
All right. Here's what's going on. The Banfield looks pretty good at this hour. Highway 26 looks pretty good. I-5 South. Pretty good shape right now. Bigfoot's on the way. We're all excited. Yeah. The weather, rain today at times. Highs about 50. It's about 37 degrees right now.
You bet we are. Bigfoot coming in the 7 o'clock hour. We've taken some of your calls. We trimmed them down. They sound good. We've got some good questions. I feel good about this, Chris.